Well, good evening. Thank you all for taking a beautiful summer evening to come indoors and join us for our post-session town hall meeting. I'm Senator Ron Latz. To my right is Representative Cheryl Youakim, and my left, Representative Peggy Flanagan. And we are the team representing you at the state capitol in St. Paul. It's been a very exciting spring session, and we are very happy to listen and communicate and converse with you about anything that's on your mind. I want to add a couple of cautionary suggestions as we open this up. First of all, of course, this is a nonpartisan event, so we ask you to please refrain from partisan politicking in your questions or in your commentary. Don't make assumptions that everyone around you shares your political viewpoints. Secondly, when you do have questions, we'll ask you to please come forward to the podium. This is being broadcast for rebroadcast on community television, so you need to be recorded and heard on that broadcast so the audience at home, when they're watching it at 10 p.m. or 2 a.m., can understand what the question is. And third, at least until we get through the first round of questions, please be mindful that there might be a whole range of other questions after you. So let's try not to re-ask the same question or revisit the same topics, at least until we've exhausted everyone who wants to ask questions or make comments, and then we can open the floor back up. We're scheduled to go until about 7:30 tonight. So we will formally end at 7:30 for anyone who wishes to leave. They won't feel like they'll be standing up and walking out in the middle of an event. Although, of course, if you feel that you have someplace else you need to go to, by all means, that's up to you. But usually we are able to stick around for a few minutes after the formal session is. If you have individual questions or comments that you'd like to share, feel free to do so. So I guess I will start off with just 30 seconds on my background, and then I'll give you my thought on a synopsis of the session, and then our representatives will do the same. I serve in the state Senate. I'm the Democratic lead on the Judiciary Committee, and I also serve on the Commerce Committee. I was elected in 2006 following 4 years in the State House of Representatives and 9 years here on the St. Louis Park City Council. I'm married, have 3 children. I'm an attorney in private practice for most of the year and even through most of the legislative session. And I'm very proud to serve the community that I grew up in, which is Golden Valley, and the community that I've lived in for 26 years now, St. Louis Park, as well as a quarter of Plymouth and all of Medicine Lake Road and all of Hopkins. So let me give you my thoughts on session. Typically, this is the second year of the biennium, so we didn't have a formal budget that we had to pass to fund state government. We had a surplus of revenues over expenses that were forecast for the completion of our biennium, the 2-year budget cycle. So we did have funds that were available to spend. And then the question became, how do you do that if you wish to spend any of it? Some of it, goes into reserves by law, sort of the rainy day fund for future ups and downs in revenues. And then the question is, do you do tax cuts, tax refunds? Do you supplement with additional spending, priorities that were established a year ago when we set the biennial budget? And are there new initiatives that we felt were priorities for funding? The bonding bill was also typically our major effort in this year, a biennial year. And then we had a new item that was the other major topic on our agenda, which was addressing the federal tax changes with our own Minnesota tax bill in an attempt to conform or at least make it as simple as possible for Minnesota taxpayers to file their taxes in light of the federal tax changes. So in order, the budget bill was passed and vetoed by Governor Dayton. I can tell you that this year, and it's not atypical in some regards, but I think it was way overdone this year, the budget bill was not clean. It was loaded with policy. These were the decisions made by the legislative majorities that control the agenda in the legislature. And a lot of the policies that were included were bipartisan, broadly supported policies, but unfortunately, many of the policies were also ones which there was great controversy over, and for purposes of analyzing why there was a veto, in large part because they were poison pills to the governor, who had said ahead of time that he was not going to sign a budget bill that included many of those policies. The budget bill was sent to him, the legislature adjourned, and the governor did what he said he was going to do, which was veto that bill. Some of those poison pills, as I would characterize them, in the supplemental budget bill included some money to address the opioid crisis, which was a good thing, but the money came out of the general fund entirely rather than including coming out of the pharmaceutical industry's revenues. The penny a pill was the governor's proposal, but there were some other ways of funding it too. But since the pharmaceutical industry, in my judgment anyway, and the governor's judgment certainly, contributed to the opioid crisis, we thought it would have been fair for them to contribute to the solution or to the repair of our communities. And the governor made very clear that he would not accept an opioid crisis provision that did not include some financial responsibility for the pharmaceutical industry. There were elder care provisions in there to help address issues relating to abuse in nursing homes and other elder care settings. However, the broad coalition of advocates for elder safety felt that the language that was in the bill was mostly written by the industry rather than by the advocates for the consumer protection there, even going so far as to say that it went backwards in terms of protecting seniors or vulnerable residents of those facilities. So that was another problem. There were actually cuts to certain state agencies in an era of surplus. That's not to say that you don't consider ever cutting budgets where appropriate, but the governor and many of us in the legislature felt that the cuts that were proposed were unnecessary, in effect would have done great harm. There were mandates that were contained in there for agencies to do certain work without funding to cover the work that they were being mandated to do. There was a tip credit for minimum wage, a somewhat controversial provision, which the governor had also made clear he was not going to accept. There was a provision in there to circumvent the Public Utilities Commission for utility ratepayers, and some controversial topics in there, and just bypass our statutory process for reviewing things. There was a language in the bill that prohibited MNLAR's funding for DPS. The MNLAR's issue is problematic enough in and of itself, but not only did the bill not include enough funding to finish off the system, but it prohibited using DPS money, Department of Public Safety money, to shift over to fix the MNLAR's vehicle registration system. There was a public school star rating system that was in there that was also quite problematic for a lot of us. There was teacher academic balance language, which was highly controversial, that was in the bill. And there was provision in there to abolish Minnesota Information Technology Department entirely and redistribute those services in other ways. Major changes that the governor wasn't going to accept. Unfortunately then, at the end of the session, many of us felt, I certainly felt, that the work that we had done in committee that was non-controversial, bills that we had found consensus on that we thought were important to become law, got caught up in all of that and did not become law because of the way it was handled. Stuff should have been, frankly, just sent as standalone bills. And that, I would say, would include the school safety bill, which got caught up later in the tax bill. There was some, actually, school safety money in a number of places. But let's turn now to the tax bill. The tax breaks themselves were heavily weighted toward multinational corporations, particularly the waiver of income of tax on the repatriated foreign funds. And the wealthy individuals in Minnesota also would have disproportionately benefited from the tax cuts in the bill. So in my judgment, and that's, that would have been a legitimate policy conversation to have with the governor, but unfortunately, there wasn't a meaningful conversation going on to find common ground on that stuff. The tax cuts that were in there were significant, but also phased in over time, over 6-8 years outside of the projected budgets. But if you projected far enough down the road, it would have left a $500 million gap in funding for the state government operations over the course of time. The effect of that would have been to squeeze the general fund in the future and making it much more difficult for us to find future revenues to increase education funding, among other budget priorities. And when you add to that the provisions on school funding that were intended to help with school safety, very little of that was actually new money from the state general fund. Most of that was changing the requirements, the restrictions on use for community education funds and staff development funds, which right now are siloed out within school budgets. For those school districts that didn't have a lot of money in those funds, of course, it doesn't help that much either. But there was, $180 or $200 million worth of funds that were there that were being trumpeted as new funds to help troubled school districts, when in fact it was just shifting funds around for them. The bonding bill, much of what was in the bonding bill was great and were worthy projects. I had some problems with the bonding bill. Number one, they had $544 million in there for transportation, meaning roads and bridges, but not one penny for transit. And not just light rail transit, but not one penny for buses, high-speed bus lines or dedicated bus services or anything like that. It was a comparatively low bonding bill. It was $825 million when the governor had proposed $1.6 billion, and the state's fiscal capacity could easily have handled the governor's proposal. We've had a lot of backed up funding needs for our infrastructure, state-owned buildings and buildings owned by the University Minnesota system and the Minnesota State University system as well. And that was another problem. There wasn't even enough money in there to cover the HEAPR, the Higher Education Asset Preservation requests of the systems. On a local basis, the bill did not contain funding for the Highway 55 Douglas reconstruction. Pedestrian underpass was proposed because the students at Purpose Center have to cross Highway 55 to get to the bus. So that was problematic. And another local project, Perspectives, out of St. Louis Park, was also not funded. That was a $4 million request. And it received seed funding in the previous bonding bill of $600,000. But there wasn't any funding in this one, and so Perspectives is kind of stuck figuring out how they're going to go ahead and do the expansion that they had planned on. This is a national model for how to transition at-risk women out of drug and housing and employment situations with young kids as well. And they need and deserve to have the funding. It was not included in there. And then some of the funding mechanisms in there didn't use general GO bonds, general obligation bonds. They turned to appropriation bonds instead, which was a much more expensive way to do it and would have cost about $46 million extra dollars because of that. So I voted against the bonding bill. The governor did decide to sign the bonding bill because he felt the projects that were in there were worthy and the clunkers that were in there were not worth killing all the other good projects over. A couple of things that were not heard that to me were problematic. Two of my main initiatives in reducing gun violence. I carried the, thank you. I carried the bills to extend background checks for gun purchases, to close the loopholes that are in existing law from private transactions at gun shows and online transactions and just private person-to-person sales. And I also carried the bill for the red flag initiative, or sometimes called the Extreme Risk Protective Order or Gun Violence Protective Orders. That study just came out June 1st, published in Psychiatry Today, a broad, statistically valid study that showed anywhere from 9 to 13% reduction in suicides in the 2 states that they measured before and after they had these extreme risk protection orders. So it literally would have saved lives, and we couldn't even get a hearing in the Senate, and they gave it a hearing and tabled it in the House. Another bill that should have passed was the hands-free cell phone bill. Broad public support for that. Actually, by the way, on the background check and the red flag bills, 90% support among the public. Star Tribune poll and every town poll, statistically valid polling data, 90% across the public, including most gun owners. So query why that didn't get a hearing, but it will eventually. It'll catch up to folks. Hands-free cell phones didn't pass either. It's now deemed to be as risky as driving drunk if you are distracted driving on your cell phone. Net neutrality was one of my bills. We couldn't get an amendment passed on the floor for net neutrality, never got a hearing. And internet privacy initiatives, which I worked on last year and again this year, again could not get a hearing in committee in the Senate. We did, however, pass a pension bill, which was a fantastic accomplishment, been several years in the works. It stabilizes the long-term funding for public servants throughout Minnesota, everywhere, teachers, local government employees, state employee retirees, and everyone part of the system contributed to this fiscal stability. So I'm very proud that we passed that pension bill. And there was one provision in there for a constituent that fixed an administrative error that had cost him his pension. So I'm very pleased that for this one individual, we were able to restore his pension, and he'll be able to retire with some stability and security. And of interest to Plymouth, the 494 Rockford Road reconstruction was included in the bonding bill, so we did get that passed. I think I've probably one person applauding for that. Thank you. So with that, I've probably gone on too long as it is, and I want to leave something for my colleagues to say. So I'll turn it over to the next most senior member of our delegation, Representative Youakim.
Thank you, Senator Latz. That was a really good overview. I'm Representative Cheryl Youakim. I live in Hopkins and represent all of Hopkins and half of St. Louis Park, south of Minnetonka Boulevard. So I am the B to Representative Flanagan's A. And I have 3 children, all grown now, off to college and med school soon, and lived in the community for just about 20 years. I serve on the Property Tax and Local Government Commission, Committee, the Transportation and Regional Governance Committee, and Government Operations and Elections. And I would probably characterize this session as missed opportunities, a lot of missed opportunities. And Senator Latz went over some of them. One of the really tough ones is the opioid epidemic we've been having. Very frustrating in the House that we should have taken the Senate's lead. Senator Julie Rosen, a Republican, who proposed knew the penny of the pill wasn't going to pass, but at least charging the pharmaceutical companies a fee. I think it passed in the Senate like 63-3. Our House leadership, Republican leadership wouldn't take up the bill at all. Elder abuse, Senator Latz mentioned that there were some provisions in the giant omnibus bill, but those provisions were basically just working groups to continue to just talk about the problem. So it did very little to address the problem. We're one of the few states left in the country that does not license assisted living. So hopefully there will be another impromptu governor's task force like he held before with AARP and other stakeholders to come together to start talking about how to address that issue. The distracted driving, that was the hugest disappointment. I heard that bill last year on Transportation Policy Committee and passed overwhelmingly, passed out of all the committees overwhelmingly, except for one. I think Representative Garofalo may have voted against it. But it was sitting on the calendar, on the general orders to be calendared in the House. And our lead Democrat on transportation, Representative Hornstein, was the second author. Representative Uglum was the Republican first author. There was broad bipartisan support. In fact, we had only heard maybe 13 people on their side, 3 people on our side didn't like the bill. Kept waiting for it to be calendared. let a lot of other bills we could amend it to pass by because Representative Hornstein kept being told by the author, don't worry, it'll happen. Last 4 days of session, the author was told it wasn't going to happen. So we made a move on the House floor to try to ask for a sense of urgency, to pull it right off the calendar, right off general orders and calendar it. This isn't a bill we were going to yank out of a committee where it didn't have a hearing. It wasn't a bill had never had any public testimony. This had had 2 years of public testimony. 4 days left in session. All we had to do was get a majority of the people to say, yes, we should vote for this. Every single person on the other side of the aisle voted no, including the author who stood up and said, today is not the day. So I'm still trying to understand what happened there, but I know it's going to come back next year. We also saw a lot of, I would characterize this session of a lot more public input and pressure on a lot of issues that people cared about. And the gun violence prevention is one of the biggest issues too, but we saw the distracted driving folks up there, we saw folks with elder abuse up there, we saw people with the opioid epidemic up there. And really finally having that two-way conversation we should always be having, and to have those voices ignored was really tough to watch this year. And it wasn't that everybody was ignoring them, it wasn't even that just part of the people were ignoring them, it was literally just a few people in leadership that were ignoring them. So, you know, I don't know how many people here are teachers who have worked in the school system. You know, you'd have a classroom of 30 kids and like two kids can like take that room down in like 5 minutes, right? Mm-hmm. That's kind of like the legislature right now. There are a few people up there that took down the session and made it not function. So I don't want people to lose hope on what representative democracy can look like, but it really didn't happen this year. So I am very frustrated about that. As Senator Latz mentioned, we had a great pensions bill that was 3 years in the making. It affects over 511,000 public employees, from teachers to firefighters to policemen to people that plow your roads, run your state parks, answer the phone at state agencies, help you file your taxes, help you drive, all that stuff. So that was a fantastic, wonderful thing that finally happened. The Senate, right out of the gate, passed it the first month. We didn't see it in the House until the last 15 minutes of session. And it had an amendment, so it had to go back to the Senate for the last 8 minutes. Once again, that was Republicans' leadership's decision. I don't want to get too partisan here, but I'm very frustrated with just a small minority kind of like taking everything over, and that's what happened. The Senate did a great job moving bills through and trying to have those discussions that we're supposed to be having. Didn't see that as much in the House. Big reason for that too is the omnibus. Very few times will you get a bill that'll actually get its own hashtag on Twitter. And then we did this year. It was called the Omnibus Prime Bill. It was 998 pages. And in the past, we've mixed policy and finance together. This is the largest bill we've ever had, especially in the second year of the biennium, when it should just be a supplemental budget bill and then some policy bills. They put all this stuff together, and I love the fact that the public's actually talking about process and policy, because that's the thing I really love to talk about, and you folks are right front and center, understanding it, getting it, and realizing it shouldn't work this way. So yes, the Omnibus Prime Bill came to the Senate at 7:30 the last night of session. 998 pages, and if any of you follow me on Facebook or Twitter, I promise you the picture I took was actually borrowed. I tried to read it on my computer. I did not get my own copy because it was like this tall. And I think I only made it through one section in the 2 hours we had, because it got posted online at 7:30 p.m. The Senate was expected to vote on it at 9:30 p.m. We got it at 11 p.m. So it was all, you know, it was very interesting, especially the whole last week of session. I had my bags packed in my car. For the last 4 nights, I was going to sleep on my couch. I think Thursday night they sent us home at 3 p.m. Friday night we were out of there by 6 p.m. It's like, aren't we supposed to be working? Why are we going home? So not that I didn't like sleeping in my own bed, but shouldn't have probably happened. So there were a lot of poison pills in that big omnibus bill. One of my favorite ones, too, was the allowing schools to put "In God We Trust" in their front hallways as kids walked into school. And then one thing that was particularly disturbing to me, and I think should be for everybody, once again, we didn't do anything for cybersecurity. There was a lot of talk about it. The bill that ended up being in the omnibus bill was a bill of Representative Nash's who said, I want every state agency to have to put 3.5% aside in their bottom line budget for cybersecurity, which is really a good idea when it comes to accounting, but there was zero new money there. And the governor had asked for over $80 million. He'd been asking for years for money. We've had the generals talk about it. There are 2 million hits a day on our systems. Systems that have all your information in them. All the information that you can't help but give us if you want to drive a car, open a business, or file your taxes. So we really, 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 really need to be addressing that, and hopefully next session we'll get some folks up there that realize it's a really, folks in leadership that realize that it's a really big deal. So cybersecurity, there's nothing in there for that. I called it rearranging the deck chairs on the Titanic, because if you already have a state agency that's getting cut, and then you say, oh, but 3.5% has to go to this, but we're not going to give you any new money to do it, doesn't really solve the problem. You can think, we can talk afterwards about who you can thank for that. And then the tax cuts. I know people are really frustrated, and our next tax filing season is going to be a little harder for everybody. We kind of got blindsided by a huge federal reform at the federal level on the tax bill. So it's such a large reform. I think actually, in hindsight now, it's probably better that we're taking a little bit longer to figure out how it's going to look. I think we'll come back with a much better bill maybe. I was happy with the governor's approach. It really focused on middle-class families and small businesses and the businesses that are on our main streets. But I think it'll happen. It'll happen next year when people continue to put their heads together. And then you saw him veto the first tax bill, and then the second tax bill, they said, oh, we're going to send you a second one. They did. It was the same bill. It was the same bill. They just added education funding on it and said, here, we know you really care about education. You said you wouldn't sign a tax bill without education funding. Here's some money. Well, the money was $50 million of it was new dollars. $50 million of the 255 they put in there, that $50 million was from the rainy day fund. All the rest of the money was telling the districts that they could steal it from other funds. They didn't have to give the teachers the 2% to do the training, even though they were going to have to train with a whole new tiered system. It stole money from the community education funds, and it did absolutely nothing for the money they were lacking in special ed funding. So, but they sent it and said, here, we got a bill, you're gonna like it. It didn't receive any love, and it also got a veto. So those are some of the weird things that happened this session. We did have a bonding bill. I share Senator Latz's and Representative Flanagan's disappointment that Perspectives wasn't in there. It's a phenomenal organization. We're gonna try again next year. They do have their seed money. Another thing, when Senator Latz mentioned the appropriation bonds, that one's really particularly disturbing because those appropriation bonds are banking on the money that is in the LCCMR funding, which is the money that people voted on in the 1980s from the lottery to go to the environment. So they're using that money to put out these bonds. So for the length of the rest of this LCCMR, there will be no money left for new projects. So there was a lot more shifts and gimmicks again, but the pensions bill really was a highlight, complete highlight of the session. And there was some good projects in the bonding bill as well. But I'll leave something else. I'm sorry to be the Debbie Downer. I'm going to turn it over to Representative Flanagan.
Good evening, everyone. I'm Peggy Flanagan. I'm on the 46A side. I don't know that I'm going to be any less of a Debbie Downer, but I'll give it a shot. So I represent St. Louis Park, Golden Valley, Plymouth, and Medicine Lake, everything in St. Louis Park north of Minnetonka Boulevard. I live in the park. I've lived here for over 25 years, born and raised. Moved to Minneapolis for a while, then had to come home. And I have a 5-year-old who's starting kindergarten at Peter Hobart in the fall. I'm very excited about that. And I specialize primarily in nonprofit management, so that is my background. I have other extracurricular activities on the side. So I just wanted to mention a couple of things. I serve on the Health and Human Services Policy Committee, and through that also serve, I'm the DFL lead on the Affordable Accessible Childcare Subcommittee. I'm on the Rules Committee and also serve on state government finance. So where some of the action is where I have the opportunity to serve. I think some of the things that have been mentioned, clearly disappointment without any action on, any meaningful action on elder care and abuse. We have a habit now in the legislature of forming task forces to study a problem and continue to study it when we have consistently heard from people who are directly affected by policies what actually needs to change and happen. So I am hopeful that we can have some significant change next session. Of course, the opioid crisis, and in particular in that there are communities of color, the indigenous community that are affected at higher rates, and funding for that was not done, and we're disappointed. I also wanted to just briefly mention a couple of the things that I've spent time on. Clearly, childcare, it's one of the things that I care most passionately about. We've had the subcommittee. We also had a task force that went all across the state listening to providers, children, providers and families about the changes that need to be made. We consistently heard that the child care assistance program needed to have an increase in funding. That was not done. We also heard that the provider reimbursement rates, which right now for child care providers who serve children on the child care assistance care program, their reimbursement rates right now are at the 25th percentile. So these providers are taking kids, like myself, when I grew up, was on the CCAP program, are taking these families at a loss. And there was an action to bump that up to at least the 75th percentile. So we've got a lot of families. This is clearly a crisis in the urban community, in the suburbs, and throughout greater Minnesota. And it has been frustrating to, again, task force this, study it, and not have a whole lot of action on this particular issue when we hear families across the state crying out. The other thing that I would just mention, I want to thank Senator Latz for his work on gun violence prevention. This is something that we heard consistently loud and clear. My office is always the most full on either Arts Advocacy Day and days around gun violence prevention. And I'm grateful for many of the advocates who I see here who spent a lot of time and attention, and especially our young people who showed up consistently. And we should be ashamed for the inaction that occurred on those issues. The other thing that I'll just mention is Line 3, the Enbridge Pipeline, is something you've probably heard quite a bit about. There were several bills that were brought forward to just allow the pipeline to go through communities without any kind of consultation, throwing the PUC aside. We're grateful that the governor vetoed those bills, but that is also something that I spent quite a bit of time on. And then with our Native American caucus, there were several wild rice bills that went through the legislature, all connected to clean water. These were bills where we talked about meaningful consultation with the communities around them and with the tribes. And unfortunately, that continued to not happen. And so it's one of the reasons why Governor Dayton also vetoed some of those bills as well. And then the final thing that I'll say is I was incredibly disappointed. I remember sitting right here and having a conversation with you about sexual harassment legislation. I don't understand what happened. We were clearly, there were folks on both sides of the aisle who were working on this issue and failed to pass legislation on sexual harassment. This is an issue that just because a couple of bad actors are no longer serving in the legislature, it continues to exist. I think that is one of the biggest disappointments for me personally, is that did not go through. So we have a lot of work to do. And I think there are several conversations that need to be had all across the state about what it is that we value and who we value, and I think we are eager to have those conversations. How's that for keeping it nonpartisan? Okay, good. So we are just, we're eager to now hear from you and answer some of your questions, comments, or snide remarks if you have them. And then I also just want to point out as well, my legislative assistant, Akolade, is here. Some of you may have communicated with him in the past and just want to there aren't a whole lot of opportunities where we get to thank our legislative assistants in public. So I just wanted to thank Akolade, and he's here. And if you need additional assistance or have questions too, he is also available. So thanks.
All right, thank you. I will note also my LA is here. Marcus is in the back. Raise your hand if anyone has any follow-up questions or need any help. He's the person to talk to for follow-up there.
And I also wanted to say my brand new LA mate for the first time today, Cara Stromback's in the back. And
Hey,
don't
Cara.
forget, guys, if you haven't signed in, if you could sign in on the way out, that'd be great. And make sure, especially check off if you want to be added to our email lists. Thank you.
So let's open up the floor for commentary. Again, please come on up to the podium so that your question or your comment can be recorded for the broadcast.
Jim Leitner, and I know, Ron, that you're really supportive of more guidance counselors in the schools, and I was wondering, with all the talk of school safety, was there any talk about more guidance counselors, more social workers in the schools?
Jim, thank you for the question. The answer is yes. There was, as a part of the overall school safety funding package that was proposed, there was funding for increased counselors in the schools. In fact, some of us have been fighting for that for a long time. We've had one of the worst ratios of counselors to students in the nation over the years. But that's just one piece of it. The funding package that the legislature seemed to focus the most on was hardening our schools against attacks. And in my judgment, that's, it's helpful for giving people some peace of mind, but that part of it really isn't going to, in the end, protect anyone, because kids still need to get from home to the school. So even if you could create a fortress and prevent someone from getting into the school, if they really wanted to cause trouble, they would do it as the kids are coming to school and entering, or when they're leaving school at the end of the day. Throwing a whole lot of money at hardening schools, I thought, would be unhelpful in the long run, not nearly as helpful as trying to identify the at-risk students earlier through more counselors and mental health professionals and strengthening our mental health, especially the adolescent mental health care system generally, and then separating guns from people that are already identified as dangerous, either or in crisis or with some kind of a criminal or disqualifying history. Which my bills would have done.
And I'll just add too, there was $30 million in the bonding bill to harden schools, which, it is important to make sure that each school has some of those things that we see, the entrances that can be double locked, and somebody having to go in and sign in before they can actually get into the structure, and maybe some bulletproof glass where needed. But really next year, when we have the start of the new biennium and are setting the budgets, we really need to be looking at not only social workers in the schools, counselors in the schools, more support staff in the schools, but also those wraparound services our kiddos need. We are woefully lacking on mental health beds for kids under 18. I know someone that had been in crisis last year, and they were shipped hours away to find a mental health bed. So there's a lot of wraparound services that we need to be looking to for our kids too.
28 hours. I spent at the Capitol the last couple of weeks, 28 hours with a sign over my head that said, "Guns kill children. We see how you vote." And I'll be back next year. I'm ashamed of the people who tabled the bills. I'm ashamed of the leader of your Senate committee who wouldn't even collegially let you talk about your bill, wouldn't let the bill come before the committee. That's wrong. And I'm here to tell you that the number of people who are upset about this is only going to increase. And there will be more of me at the Capitol next year with signs, because I will teach them how to paint them so they're ready to be read. But it's going to end, and I got your back.
Thank you.
Thank you, Marty. You're a terrific advocate. And we will not ultimately, I don't think, have change at the legislature because of the politics of the issue until some members of the legislature lose their seats over this. Those who are advocates for gun rights are single issue, many of them are single issue voters. And it's not only the power of the NRA, there are also some groups in Minnesota that are organized around the same issues, but part of it is the NRA, and they motivate their voters, and those voters will make their voting decisions on who to support in the ballot box based on that single issue. It's that important to them, and they will turn out to vote. And if a legislator doesn't agree with them or a candidate doesn't agree with them, they will run against them in primaries or in the endorsement process. So we haven't up until now had the kind of political balance on our side of the issue where legislators will be afraid if they don't vote with us on this. And that's the kind of change that ultimately is going to happen at the Capitol. So if there are particularly some suburban legislators where this is the significant issue in their reelection campaign this November, and they get called out for their position on it, and they lose because they don't support the initiatives that we support, that will send a message to all of the legislators that they are politically at risk by disagreeing with us, just like right now they think they're politically at risk by disagreeing with the Gun Owners Caucus.
Ron, a couple of things I wanted to talk about. The opioid bill. I have a degree of expertise on this subject that I doubt many people in this room have. I am a recovered alcoholic and heroin addict. 3 times in my 32 years of recovery, I have been prescribed opioids for pain. I stand here today before you, completely free of drugs, not addicted. You know, how would this bill have done anything to help stop the opioid addiction? It would not. The problem is there are a number of organizations in the community that for free that I have used that would deal with this problem very successfully. So, you know, and another question I have about this is the tax is a penny a pill. When would that go up to 2 cents a pill, a nickel a pill, a dime a pill? When, where and when would it stop? It wouldn't. So this opioid bill, from my personal experience, would not work. So, in fact, I had an older brother who was prescribed opioids. He refused to take them, even though he was in severe pain from a broken leg. 5 to 10% of the population is at risk of becoming addicted to opioids if they are prescribed for them. And then I have one final question that will not make me very popular here. But where in America have gun control laws reduced gun violence? Nowhere.
New York City.
Chicago has the highest rate of gun violence in the country.
Brian, I want to thank you for your comments about the opioids, and thank you for being brave to tell your personal story. I really do appreciate it. I think you're right. I think there's a lot of other things that we need to do besides just having the pharmaceutical companies pitch in. You mentioned a lot of free programs that are in the community. Those programs aren't free. They're being funded by, by taxpayer dollars. They're being funded by nonprofit dollars. That money's coming from somewhere, and all we're saying is that the people that are making all the money on the pills should have to pitch in a little bit on that. And I think I like the fee structure better than the penny on the pill, because I think
Cheryl,
it's
could you
less,
use the microphone?
I think it's less possible that it's going to be passed on to the consumer. So, but another thing that I think our community is starting to do very well, is teaching both our dentists and our physicians about how they prescribe. And when I sat in this room back in the beginning of February, I had been here, I had 4 days before that, I had had some major surgery with, minor surgery with gallbladder, and I had been in the emergency room, and I had been only given 10 pills when I left home, left for home, which is the way it should be. And I think our physicians are starting to learn about what that is. So you're right, it's not just about the pharmaceutical companies, it's about the people prescribing it, it's about where we help and take that money and help people that are in need. So I just wanted to say I appreciate you sharing your story and just give you a little bit of my thoughts. Thank you.
I think this is, I also appreciate you sharing your story, and I think many of us, myself included, have someone that we love and care about who has been affected by this crisis. And continues to be affected by this crisis. So when we talk about the penny a pill, and we worry about that increase, and I hear you, but I also know that in the final 2 weeks of the session, Big Pharma spent tens of thousands of dollars sending new lobbyists to the Capitol to ensure that this bill was not passed. That if Big Pharma sent new lobbyists,
Is not the problem.
spent tens and thousands of dollars on lobbyists talking about how we could find a solution, then I would believe that somehow they were invested in fixing this problem. We're not yet there. So I think it's just really important to take a step back and look at who's showing up to talk about these issues. And frankly, who doesn't have well-paid lobbyists at the Capitol? It's folks who are dealing with this crisis personally. I had a proposal for an additional $1 million for culturally relevant support for families across the state. That didn't get picked up. It didn't get funded. So we continue to say, and we've got folks on both sides of the aisle who care passionately about this issue. And unfortunately, the thing that brings them together is that because they've lost loved ones, they've lost children due to this crisis. And so I think it is, it's time. There's too many tragedies that have been caused, and I don't necessarily see Big Pharma coming up with a solution other than sending an army of more lobbyists to the Capitol to say no when there aren't alternative solutions. So that has to stop.
So I will address the gun issue. I actually have some statistics to assist in responding to this, but I just want to highlight one issue in Chicago. Certainly there are multiple causes to gun violence, no question about that. And the kind of bills that I was supporting would have addressed only one piece of that
The
problem.
laws in Chicago are what you were supporting.
But part of the issue with Chicago is that, I mean, there's not a wall at the border of Chicago. Indiana is right next to Chicago, and Indiana does not have restrictive gun laws. So it's very easy for Chicago residents to drive to Indiana, buy all the guns they want, and bring them back into Chicago. So that's an argument basically for national legislation that would be more restrictive of access to firearms. And I'll give you some statistics to back this up. I've got actually an email here that just came in this afternoon, from Aaron Cavisto, who was one of the two authors of this article, Effects of Risk-Based Firearm Seizure Laws in Connecticut and Indiana on Suicide Rates, just published in the Psychiatric Services Journal, which is a peer-reviewed journals. So it's received the review of other statisticians and experts in the field to verify that it's statistically valid results. And what they had to say is that Indiana's firearm seizure law was associated with a 7.5% reduction in firearm suicides in the 10 years following its enactment, and compared to suicides with firearms in larger that can be seen in comparison states by chance alone. And in Connecticut, the law had a 1.6% reduction in firearm suicides immediately after its passage, and a 13.7% reduction in firearm suicides in the post-Virginia Tech period when enforcement of the law substantially increased. So the red flag bill that I carried has very substantial statistical support for it being successful. And in Connecticut, the other figure that I have been informed is that they believe they've saved, I think in the last couple of years now, 72 deaths by suicide because they've utilized the red flag bill in Connecticut to intervene and to remove firearms from a person who is in crisis. The other point that I'll make is that the statistical information with regard to background check bills shows that in states with background checks before every handgun sale, there are 48% fewer suicides by gun, 46% fewer women are shot to death by their domestic partners, 48% fewer police officers who die by handgun fire, 48% fewer incidents of trafficking, and 52% fewer mass shootings. So the data that I have points out the effectiveness of the laws that I've proposed that we pass in Minnesota. Now, I want to add, for people who are Second Amendment advocates and are concerned about gun rights, if you are a law-abiding gun owner, you have nothing at all to fear from these legislative proposals. Because if you are not already disqualified because of a disqualifying criminal conviction, you will pass the background check and you will have no trouble getting your firearm. If you are at risk because you're going through some kind of a mental health or emotional crisis, and a court determines after an independent review of the facts that are suggested by law enforcement, petitioned by law enforcement, not by family members or by people who might have a vendetta or some reason to try to cause you trouble, but they would have to convince law enforcement to go to the court, and a judge would have to agree that the allegations are such and the risk is serious enough and immediate enough that it warrants removing the firearms promptly from your access, then probably you're saving your own life. Because in Minnesota, 62% of suicides are by firearm. I mean, that's a lot. And we can literally save lives in Minnesota and around the country by having these kinds of proposals. So none of this contradicts those who believe in the right to possess firearms, except to put some reasonable regulations around those who we have already determined, who our legislature, our state laws have already determined are dangerous enough that they should not possess firearms. These are people who have convictions for felony violent offenses, former firearms offenses, burglaries, domestic violence convictions, even at the misdemeanor level, assault histories, drug dealing convictions. These are the kind of convictions that would disqualify you from possessing a firearm and purchasing a firearm. And the bill that I proposed would utilize the existing system of permits to purchase and permits to carry to do the background check on an initial application, then annually after that, at no charge to the applicant. To do the background check, you pass the background check, and you get the permit to purchase, and then you have to show that permit to purchase in order to transact, if you want to buy a firearm. No restrictions on the number of firearms you can buy with that permit. Actually, what I had proposed, the last proposal I made was a 5-year duration for that permit to purchase with an annual requirement for a background check, unless, of course, an agency wanted to do more frequent background checks, particularly if they thought they had someone who be at risk, or if they know someone got a new conviction, they want to make sure that they're still valid to hold the permit to purchase. So it uses the existing system, existing law, existing disqualifying factors. No expansion of that. All it would do, however, is it would close off the pathways where the guns are now purchased illegally. So those are the proposals, and I certainly respect your right to hold your opinion. I disagree with it. I think at least the factual information that I've gathered from the studies would lead to a different policy conclusion than the one that you're suggesting. And I would suggest, if you are, lawfully possessing firearms now, you'd have no reason, unless if you are currently lawful, you'd have nothing to fear from any of these proposals.
And I just had one more thing to add too. A few years ago, I went out and got my permit to purchase just to see what the process was like and how easy it was. I walked down to my police department in Hopkins. I gave them my information. That was about 11 o'clock a.m. in the morning. By 4 p.m. in the afternoon, they were calling me back to pick up my card that was good for a year. It didn't cost me anything except some time. So it is very easy to do, and I did it just to see what the process was like. And I would probably be taking a conceal and carry class as well, or conceal carry class as well, just to see what the process is like. Because we have to make sure we understand all of it when we write the bills too.
Are both of these working?
I think so.
Okay. And my name is Rachel Freed, and I live in the Wolf Lake neighborhood. And I have two questions. The first one is, why don't I see anything anywhere about funds for the homeless, housing and funds for the homeless? That's my first question. My second one is for you, Ron. You should know that there is rumor out and about that you backed a bill that would prohibit people from protesting. So I want to know about what's true and what's not true about that. Thank you.
Sure.
Second question.
So there was a proposal this year for additional $140 million in support for housing and for people who are homeless. The Minnesota Coalition for the Homeless pushed this initiative. Unfortunately, it didn't go very far, and I think we continue to hear every year there's the Homeless Day on the Hill. And every year we gather with hundreds of folks, myself included, to talk about the need for this funding. So I think if we want to be real about it, the real number to start to turn the curve on this issue is $300 million in bonding. I think that is something that we need to advocate for, because when we look at this issue, and you know this, but I think it bears worth repeating, children, families, individuals don't come in pieces, right? We have to look at the entire person, or the whole family. And so housing is really the foundation of that, as we're increasingly losing additional naturally occurring housing, affordable housing. There's much more that we can do at the legislative level, and one of the first things to do is to increase that bonding to at least $300 billion. The other thing that I would say is, I was talking to someone just this past weekend who said, well, I mean, really, the issue of affordable housing, it's primarily in the urban areas. And I thought, no. So talked about, even here in our own community, what the need is, as well as, this issue of families being homeless or highly mobile in greater Minnesota. It occurs. It just looks a little different. And so I appreciate your question. We certainly need to do more. And when we look at issues around health, education, transportation, safety, all of these things are connected to housing. So we have much more that we need to do. And I think this is an issue that also can have bipartisan support.
There was a small amount of money in the bonding bill too for the Minnesota Housing Fund and Authority to do nonprofit housing infrastructure appropriation bonds. And there was some Homes for All advocates that got some money in there too. So there was some for the structures, but we need to do much more, especially for workforce housing in all of our communities, like Representative Flanagan said, especially in greater Minnesota, where there's some jobs, but then you don't have the housing that are next to those jobs, and then you don't have the transit for those that don't live next to those jobs. So it's a whole, you connect affordable housing with accessible transportation and accessible jobs, and it could work, but we just need to fund it.
So Rachel, let me address your second question about the anti-protest bill. The rumor is, as you characterized it, is not accurate. There was a proposal to limit protests to certain locations, and actually to increase the existing criminal penalty for those who protest in those areas. So let me be more specific. Under current law, it is a misdemeanor crime to protest on freeways, at the airport, and in a manner that blocks transit. All right, that's current law. The proposal was to increase that to a gross misdemeanor crime for protests that are conducted on freeways, which had a careful definition in it, limited access, so basically on-ramp and off-ramp freeway situations, not four-way stop signs or traffic lights, and at the airport, and in a manner that would block transit. The position that I took, and it's been over a year since I took the position, because the bill was proposed in the January 2017 legislative session. The position I took, and I do take, is the same one that Governor Dayton takes, which is in support of the bill, except with regard to one provision, which the governor used as the basis for his opposition to that provision, which was he felt that the language regarding transit interference was ambiguous, was not clear enough to tell people exactly what was and was not lawful, and so he vetoed the bill on that basis. But in my judgment, I support a person's right to protest 100%. And protest has a great history in our country in causing change, and I fully support that. Where I think it's a particular problem is when the protest location is one that will interfere with the public safety in such a substantial way that lives are placed at risk. Not only the lives of the protesters, but lives of others. And I'm familiar with one case in which there was a delay in an ambulance getting to a house of 7 minutes. And because of the ambulance's delay, not because of a protest, because the ambulance got lost, which was a different issue, but the delay had the effect, according to the medical professionals, of causing the woman who had suffered a stroke and was being denied oxygen to her brain to suffer lifelong debilitating brain injury. Resulted in a, I don't know, $11 or $12 million jury verdict in a personal injury case against the ambulance company. And I bring that up because you can have even a short delay of emergency vehicles that are stuck on a highway and don't have the ability to get off the highway quickly or to get to a person who needs emergency help or a fire that needs emergency help as quickly. And lives are at risk and can well be lost because of that kind of delay. So individuals that are in a highway where they don't know, that there's a protest going on up ahead, they just see traffic slowing down and then stopping. If you got 300-500 cars that are surrounding you, there's no way for them to move out of the way, even to let an ambulance or an emergency vehicle through. So to me, that was not a risk that is worth taking. When 99.9% of our space in our communities, in our society, is available for protest in a way that will not cause that kind of significant public safety risk. Same goes with the airports. There are people who is not only a dangerous location to protest generally, but the level of disruption of people's lives. And I don't in any way mean to demean the disruption that has generated the protest. I mean, the cause, the people that are protesting about. I understand as much as I can, the motivation for those protests. And I support much of those protests that we've seen in recent years. But if a person is trying to catch a flight to get to their father's funeral, and because they can't get to the airport, they miss their flight, and they miss their father's funeral, to me, that's a really significant price for that individual to pay. And I don't think that's appropriate. I think we ought to attempt to deter protests from interfering that way. Someone who is trying to get to a family member who, is on a deathbed. Same situation. Maybe they can't catch their flight, and as a result, their parent passes away before they can get to the hospital in another city. To me, that's not worth the protest situation. Now we can have a conversation about whether this purpose of someone, whatever life event this person misses because they are stuck on a highway and can't get off, is worth the increased penalty or not, and it's a legitimate discussion to have. But when I analyzed the whole scenario, understanding that it is already illegal to do this, to me, an increased penalty ought to have a deterrent effect, so that protests are more appropriately, on city streets, where someone who needs to get to an emergency, where emergency vehicles need to get somewhere without any delay, have alternative routes and are less likely to be blocked and frozen in place. So that was the basis for my decision. I articulated this in the same manner over a year ago when the issue came up in a conference committee for the Public Safety Omnibus Bill during our budget session in 2017. I made a statement on the Senate floor this year when it came up because I wanted my constituents to know the rationale behind my decision to support that provision in the bill.
I would just suggest that if there's a way, that it would be great if you could let your constituents know the detail that you just gave us.
Thank you, Rachel. I will, and maybe what we'll do, and Marcus is here, so maybe what we'll do is make available to anyone who wants to a clip of my floor remarks when the bill came up in the Senate, where we can put together a little paragraph that explains this to anyone who's interested in seeing it. We can make it available. Thank you for the suggestion.
So this is a little tricky because I don't often disagree with my senator. And perhaps we had one, in my opinion, what I experienced was one of the most racist, Islamophobic, anti-Indigenous sessions we've had in a long time. And whether or not it was the intention, this bill sort of underlined much of that rhetoric that was heard in the House. Along with the People of Color and Indigenous Caucus, there are 9 members of us in the House. This was a bill that we met with the governor to talk about. We sent him a letter. We had many conversations on the floor. And one of the individuals who spoke to this was Representative Rena Moran, who is just the second African-American woman elected to serve in the House. And when she talked about, we had some of our colleagues on the other side of the aisle talk about being inconvenienced. She talked about the inconvenience of being terrified to send her son, who's an African-American boy, out every day and wondering whether or not he's going to come home. For myself, and I said it on the floor, so I'm sure this will be, fodder for some folks later on, but, I walked behind Philando Castile's mother on the light rail tracks because as a mom, I didn't know what else to do. And so during that debate on the floor, one of my colleagues on the other side of the aisle said, "Oh, she was trespassing." I said, "Yes, I was, and I do it again. And this is just one of those places where, in my opinion, the punishment does not fit the crime. It's 90 days right now for a misdemeanor versus a gross misdemeanor, which is up to a year in jail, which is the same kind of penalty that you'd receive for like domestic assault. And the point that we do agree on is the really the foundation of listening to people who feel like the only option they have to be heard is to walk on the highway and to put themselves at risk. There are many voices in the state that are not being heard. And I think that there's folks who feel invisible at best and disposable at worst. When I think of the feeling and emotion that folks must have in order to be seen, and the option that you feel like you have is to walk on the highway, then we need to listen to people as to why they are making that choice and try to find solutions there. But the one other thing that I would say on this particular issue is simply that these are the things that took up the bulk of debate on the floor. Not ensuring that people had access to Minnesota Care, not ensuring that we had more access to child care or that elders were protected, or that we had additional support for people who are homeless or highly mobile, but bills around increasing penalties for protesting. So I just want to lift that up and say, even if we don't always agree on the policy points, we agree on making sure that we are valuing the people whose hearts are breaking, and that we all can agree on. We have better things to spend our time on talking about on the House floor. So I appreciate this dialogue and know that this is a tough issue for many of us, and can see folks on both sides. So I appreciate being able to have a thoughtful conversation with my senator.
And I just wanted to add too, toward the end of session the last 2 weeks, there were still 131 bills on the general registry that had made it through the process that didn't get calendared because we didn't have time. We heard this protest bill 3 times this year. 3 times, hours and hours on the floor, hashing it over again and again so it can be put on a piece of campaign lit. That's not okay. If we spent that many hours actually listening to the people that were doing the protesting, maybe we'd be a little further along in Minnesota.
Hi, Carol.
I'm one of the people. I've been protesting. I've been arrested. I've had my home, a lien put on my home and had it sold because I had refused to pay the percentage of my income taxes that went towards war. I've been arrested at Honeywell. I've been arrested in Congressman's office. And I have a 59-year-old son named Martin, after Martin Luther King, because I have been involved in the civil rights movement for one heck of a long time. And I agree with, this may surprise you, I agree with Ron. I feel that civil disobedience works best when the people being inconvenienced are the people who are profiting by the problem or have created the problem. For example, if you're sitting in at a lunch counter of a place that will not serve people of color, they are not making any money while you're occupying their seats. When you boycott a bus system, like in Montgomery, the bus company loses money because you're not riding their bus. I have been involved at times. For example, I was in a legal march just on sidewalks down at Hennepin and Lake. And another group, I think it was called Anarchist Bowling League. That was the name of the group. They pushed a newspaper stand into the middle of Hennepin and Lake and set it on fire. the buses were all stopped on Hennepin and Lake because there, no traffic could go through. And a very elderly woman came out of the door from the doctor's offices that were on that corner up above. And her bus, she expected to catch right outside of that door, her bus was not coming because the street was blocked. So we half carried her several blocks up and over so she could catch a bus. And it hit me then that the people being inconvenienced, often people on mass transit, 3 Unitarian ministers, and I'm a Unitarian, were part of the group that just blocked the light rail a week or so ago. And again, the people riding mass transit generally aren't the decision makers and the leaders of the community. They're the people inconvenienced often when you're blocking a highway. The ones that suffer aren't the CEOs of the companies or the legislators or others. They're the person who has a job in a nursing home and they don't show up when the shift changes, or they're going for a job interview and they didn't make it. Those are the people who end up losing their opportunities because of what somebody else was doing to make a point. And so my biggest concern, though, also is the public safety issue, because when I think I used to demonstrate, my kids went with me, on marches everywhere. We were always just on, even in Selma and places like that, you generally were on half of a road, the other half was open. You weren't blocking it. But when I think of people down on 94, and all it takes is one hothead in an 18-wheeler to decide they're going to crash through and run into these people who are blocking this way, and what it could do to people and their children, that to me, that just isn't worth the risk. And especially because I don't think you build a movement by simply making everybody mad at you. I think if you're going to make people mad and inconvenience them, then try to target it to the people who really need to be inconvenienced in this society. And it usually isn't your run-of-the-mill folks who just happen to be going somewhere on their way to work. And anyhow, I don't think you probably would have too much testimony down there from the people who've been arrested. So that's why I decided today, when it was mentioned, maybe I had to put in my 2 cents worth, because I am from that other side. And I wouldn't be here if it was going to be a felony. I would be on the opposite side. But a gross misdemeanor, I think that's okay.
Let me just add one thought. When I was in college, I went and protested at the Wisconsin State Capitol over apartheid. A bunch of students basically took over the state capitol. And we occupied the Capitol for about a week. I spent one night there sleeping on the marble floors. Frankly, I probably put my academic standing at risk by doing that. But apartheid was a big issue in those days when I was in college. There were protests around the country, and I felt strongly about that. So I'm no stranger to protests, and I served on the National Board of the Anti-Defamation League, which exists to fight for civil rights and against discrimination. So like Peggy said, like Cheryl said, there's a lot of common ground here about the importance of protest movements and of social change and of prioritizing our time that we spend properly to address the underlying causes. There's certain tactics, I guess, that we might disagree on, the balance, how to approach things, that's all. Who else would like to speak on? Go ahead.
I'm wondering what you think are the ways, Peggy, and actually all three of you, about listening to what's being said. If Philando Castillo's girlfriend had not had the presence of mind, and I cannot imagine how she did what she did, the world would not still believe what happened. And I know there's so many factors. One of mine as a psychologist is we're putting police continually back into the same stew pot. And if you've got police administration or lawyers or whatever who are telling cops that they can kill people, and I know that the rate in Minnesota is actually lower than it is in many places. But those are the kind of forces that generate an idea where police can do what they choose to do in a situation. And I really think, our dislike of mental health is one of the reasons that police get no support when going out on the street. They should not go back out into the street when they've been in a deeply post-traumatic stress situation. Post-traumatic stress disorder is relievable. It's curable, and there's some fantasy running around that says the opposite. So I just wonder, what could we do more to change the climate where we listen and we respond? What are the things we need to do?
Well, I was just going to add, thank you, Elaine, so much. I know we did a lot more on money for training, and you're right. Our law enforcement needs all the tools they can in the toolbox to get through some of the really horrific things they have to deal with. I know with the workman's comp bill this year, too, we added PTSD for our firefighters and our first responder personnel. But we do have to shine more of a light on the issues that folks that are doing jobs that, frankly, a lot of us wouldn't want to do face every day. And that is a big part of this as well, and the training. And I know Senator Latz, having been the chair of judiciary, could talk about that a little bit more, too.
Well, we for a long time, we did not have sufficient funding in the law enforcement training funds. We still don't have a good long-term funding mechanism to silo those funds like we have for firefighter training, which is funded by a surcharge on insurance policies. So they've got plenty of funding for that. But we have noodled around, the kind of training that's required. There are a certain number of credits that are required for ongoing training for police officers, for example, just like there are for many other professions. And a lot of departments now are providing training on how to de-escalate our crisis intervention training. And the state is helping to pay for a lot of that training as well. And you can tell which agencies or which individuals in an agency have had that kind of training and who are skilled at using it to de-escalate situations that in other cases might escalate into hard confrontations, physical injury or death on either side. And those are outcomes we don't want to see. So that's an important piece of it. A lot of it depends on the leadership within a particular law enforcement agency too. How open are they to conversations with the community? How aggressively do they outreach into the community to have informal conversations that way, and are there institutional mechanisms set up for more formal communication as well? The only thing I would add is that I think it's important when there are incidents that we step back for a few moments anyway before we reach conclusions about what might have happened. The Philando Castile situation was an unusually well-documented event, but most of them are not. And lots of people draw conclusions about what they think happened before a lot of the investigation can take place. So for purposes of effective communication and effective change, I think it's helpful to at least make sure we try to get a common set of facts together so we can draw appropriate conclusions and lessons from whatever happened in particular events.
It's clear to me that we need additional resources, as we talked about, for training, but for implicit bias training in particular. And that's something that we actually did within the House. All of the House members were actually trained in implicit bias, and I think that that is where it starts, is at the policy-making level, and then ensuring that our law enforcement is able to go through that training as well. We know that the African-American community and actually the Native American community is more likely to be killed by police officers than any other population per capita. And so when we think about folks who are at risk, those are the communities I think where we need to focus and be intentional about our relationship building. I'd also say that I think St. Louis Park has actually done a pretty good job of being intentional about looking at data. And looking at the racial data for folks who have been stopped, arrested, and start to look at trends so that they can understand the implicit bias that exists within the department itself. And I think that that's what it's going to take. I have lived in communities where I watched children run towards the police, and I have lived in communities where I watched children run away from the police. And so I know what is possible, and I think it's through that intentional community relationship building with law enforcement. But that requires that folks on both sides are willing to be engaged and involved, and I think we do a good job here, but it certainly is something that we need to be more intentional about across the state, and I think we've got a good model in the park.
Yeah, that community understanding is also aided when law enforcement officers have a variety of cultural backgrounds on the force.
Right.
So they can respond appropriately and they can understand some of the cultural cues that they're witnessing in the community, and they don't misinterpret them in ways that escalate a situation. St. Louis Park has very intentionally reached out to find law enforcement officers from non-traditional sources, and so that they can bring in more culturally diverse police force to deal with a very culturally diverse community.
I know there's two other people waiting for questions, so let's take those next.
I want to thank both of you, or all three of you guys, for everything you do, the things you guys miss, the events and things. I think that's forgotten about when you serve at the state. You can't make it to all of your family events. One of the things I want to talk about is economic stability as we go through this. As we go up through the economics, there's a recession somewhere coming. There always is. It seems like we're losing Fortune 500 companies in this state from time to time. What can the legislature do to help the business climate so we can pay for all these things that we want to do?
Well, first let me suggest that sometimes we lose a Fortune 500 company, but we've also gained Fortune 500 companies. There are, I think, in the last year, we lost one, which is moving to Florida, which if some of you saw the op-ed piece in the Star Tribune a couple of days ago, they may live to regret their move to Florida, or their executives might, because they're going to miss the quality of life in Minnesota. But we also gained 2 or 3 companies at the same time. And most of our big Fortune 5 companies are ones that have grown up indigenously here in Minnesota because we have invested in quality K-12 system and a quality higher education system, and workforce training through our Minnesota State University system, and in our research facilities at the University of Minnesota, which have a lot of offshoots with startup companies. And we have a very diverse business or economy here, which is another great benefit of being in Minnesota. And that's one thing that we can facilitate. On the state level, we have something to say about business climate, but that just doesn't mean reduce taxes. As this op-ed piece in Florida, it was an individual from Minnesota whose company got transferred to Florida. And he went down there, and after 5 years, his kids and his family were begging him to come back to Minnesota because they didn't even have parent-teacher conferences in the schools. For example, in the high school that they were in, they didn't have enough staff to finish off the school day, so the kids were always let out an hour early. I mean, we have a quality of life here that is supported by what our taxes pay for, including that workforce development in the educational system that is the fertile ground for successful businesses. So from our standpoint, when we're making budgetary decisions, and we want to invest in those kinds of things, and we could have a whole seminar on all the different kinds of economic development efforts that state's involved in. But at the bottom line, from my standpoint, is human capital. It's the people, and right now we have a workforce shortage in Minnesota. We have businesses that are looking for qualified people. One thing that we can do very intentionally, and the solution isn't quite as easy as identifying the problem, but if we close the achievement gap, the racial gap in achievement, we will go a long way toward addressing our workforce shortage. The number, I don't have a number at hand, but I've been told, this was probably a year or two ago now, but if we closed the achievement gap that's based upon race, we would no longer need to fill our workforce shortages with people coming in from outside of Minnesota. We'd have enough people living in Minnesota to fill all those jobs. Right now, we depend upon in-migration, much of it from outside the United States, to come into Minnesota to supply our businesses with the workers that they need.
I'd just add too, we just hit the Newsweek's top 10 states again to have for business climate. We have our angel investors credit that we try to get money again for this year. A lot of different funding streams to help get that gap funding to get from ideas to implementation. What Senator Latz said about making sure that we actually have an attractive workforce is a huge thing. And then another thing too is that I think falls off the radar, except when Amazon tried to come here, is our investment in transit. You can have employees and you can have businesses, but if you don't have a way to get the employees to the businesses, you have a huge issue. They're facing that down in Shutterfly, down in Shakopee, at the Amazon Distribution Center down there. So I think there's a lot of wraparound things that we can do as a state to make sure that not only is the climate good for businesses that they want to stay here, but that we're also making sure that they have all the other things that they need to make their businesses successful. I have a brother-in-law that just moved here from South Carolina to start a second business after he sold his first one. Little shout out to him if you've ever used the Passport parking app in St. Paul. That was my brother-in-law. He sold that. Now he's on to his new one, but he came here to start it. They're looking at starting a family, and they know the quality of life here. So I think there's a lot of things that we could be doing. Are we perfect right now? No, there's always room for improvement.
While you're approaching, I'm trying to find on my computer here the list that Governor Dayton sends out every now and then with the latest Minnesota in the top 10 of this or that, the number 2 or number 1 or number 3. And every time he sends out notice of the new award, he includes the long list of the awards that recognition that Minnesota has received for being in the best quality of life, for seniors, the best quality of life, business climate, startup, climate, educational, everything. So I can't put my fingers on it right now, but it's out there somewhere.
Because even though we're Minnesota nice, we're still really competitive.
Yes.
Well, Mr. Dayton actually makes a pretty good segue. You had said earlier that your vote or rather your positions on SF 676, what's also called the anti-protest bill, was analogous to Mr. Dayton's, but that's not factually accurate, is it? Because in both committee and on the floor, you voted in favor of that bill, didn't you?
Yes, I did.
And Governor Dayton, in fact, vetoed it.
Yeah, and I already explained what he said in his veto remarks.
So to be
the
fair, a
basis for
yes is not really the same as a no. And when we look at the actual problem that you're trying to deal with in the statute, you would also characterize it as simply an increase in the penalties. But that leaves out one other important change in the wording of that statute. That statute presently says transit operator. The amendment you're talking about eliminates the word operator, doesn't it?
Sir, I'm not sure which amendment you're referring
SF
to.
676.
Well, that's a bill, so I'm not
The-
sure what
the
amendment.
bill. I'm sorry,
not
the
sure
Schoen
what the-
amendment the Schoen amendment, I believe, was the last one to SF 676.
Okay.
But SF 676 does include, presently, the statute that it's modifying includes the language transit operator, and it's 609 something, I forget the name of that particular criminal statute.
Okay, so I don't have the bill in front of me, so I'm not in a position to agree or disagree with you. I'll take your word for it that that was part of the language that was proposed to be changed. And that might well be the particular language that Governor Dayton was concerned about when he explained as his reason for vetoing the bill was because the transit language was not clear enough for him. When the bill was first proposed, he described protesters that went down on the highway as being irresponsible. I'm not necessarily adopting his language, but he also made clear in his veto language that had it not had the ambiguity problem with the transit, he supported the other provisions in the bill that dealt with highways or freeways and dealt with the airport.
Well, and that ambiguity problem was a pretty big change to the law. When you've got something that addresses a penalty for interfering with a transit operator, and you make it a penalty for interfering with transit, that's a pretty big change, isn't it? And when you increase the penalties for something like that, increasing it from 90 days in jail to up to a year, a $1,000 fine to a $3,000 fine, let alone the cost of spending almost a year in jail, for a lot of these protesters, that's not a deterrent. That's crushing someone's life for engaging in peaceful dissent. This would never, when in our history would we ever accepted something like this? Martin Luther King blocked off in 1965 a major highway down south. And even if he hadn't, he ran into a line of police that were doing that very thing. Should Martin Luther King have been thrown in jail for a year for that protest? Was that would have been the way to handle it? I mean, we talk about the inconvenience of maybe having to miss a bus. The ambulance problem, I'm sorry, it sounds more like you bought the defense theory, hook, line, and sinker, than having an actual justification. Because an ambulance gets lost is not a public policy problem. That's an ambulance problem. There's multiple people in that ambulance. Every one of them probably has a device that has a GPS on it. The fact that they couldn't find the way is not the fault of the protesters. And we can't create laws like this that limit free speech because of individual stories like that, that when you peel back all of the layers really don't cut the mustard. Now, I know it's really inconvenient to miss your bus, but I'd like to think that it's a whole lot more inconvenient to be constantly targeted disproportionately and in fact killed by police officers. You talk about gun violence and how important all lives are, and that's an important perspective. So let's think about the fact that for a big section of the population, they're victims of gun violence for people that hold those guns not just lawfully, but as law enforcement. All life matters, and so does all speech.
So thank you for your comments, sir. Let me just give you a couple of responses real briefly. One is for the ambulance that's already caught in a sea of 300 stopped vehicles, GPS won't help them get out of there. A helicopter blade might, but GPS won't help them at all. Secondly, the change from operator to delete the language operator from the statute, I suspect the intent was for people who would to step in front of light rail trains on operating rail tracks. They may not be interfering directly with the train operator on board, but they are placing themselves and others at just as much risk, perhaps more risk in that kind of a situation. And with regard to the penalty change, I mean, let's be perfectly clear. I work in the courts in Minnesota every day, in the criminal justice system. 90-day maximum penalty under the statute does not mean that anyone serves 90 days in jail. It's quite rare with misdemeanor convictions, depending upon the kind of case, certainly if it's a first-time offense, to spend any time in jail. A gross misdemeanor, even though the maximum penalty under the statute is 365 days in jail, again, very, very rare that they would serve any time in jail. There are some differences in procedures when one is arrested. In some cases, you're more likely to be held until you're seen in court, maybe for a day or two, or you may have a higher bail amount if they're gonna set bail at all for you. But in terms of the actual consequence, very, very limited. Unless, you know, there is a refusal to comply with conditions of probation, for example, or unless there's a criminal history that would give rise to more substantial imposition of penalties. You can also put this in perspective. You know, if you steal something that is over $500 in value, it's a gross misdemeanor. All right, so gross misdemeanors run the gamut, and misdemeanors run the gamut, and that's one of the issues within our criminal justice statutes is proportionality. You know, what's comparable in terms of penalties, but we only have three main categories. We got, well, petty misdemeanors like a traffic ticket for which you cannot be put in jail, a speeding ticket. Misdemeanors with a maximum penalty of 90 days in jail. Grosses with a maximum of 365 days in jail. And then felonies, anything a year and a day and longer. But within those categories, you've got 1,000 different, you know, criminal statutes in Minnesota. There's no way that you can make sure everything is proportional. And that's why we have a lot of discretion with the prosecutors, the defense, and the judges ultimately in determining what's the appropriate consequence for a particular case. Quite often there are alternatives to jail. Sometimes it's community service. Sometimes it's a matter of how much is the fine going to be. So it's a lot more complicated than simply saying someone's going to go to jail for 365 days, because they aren't. I've never seen that on a first offense. And if they did, unless they chose to, I suppose they could execute their sentence, but if they did, there'd be no probationary period. And most prosecutors and judges would prefer to see someone on probation for a year, for example, than have them sit in jail for a year, which would probably not be productive for anyone, for any purpose. So that puts that, I hope, in a little more context. So we are now 10 minutes to 8. We've gone past our 7:30 deadline, but I think it's been a worthwhile discussion. Perhaps if there's one more person that wanted to ask a question or make a comment, and then we'll wrap it up.
Thank you. A few years ago, I attended a hearing on aid and dying, compassionate choices, and nothing went from that a few years back. What's the status now, and might it be coming up in the future?
You know, I don't know. Is that in the House?
Until Democrats are back in power.
Well, and actually, you know, no, it's represent in the House. I know it's Representative Freiberg's bill, and it's I'm trying to remember, not Rosen, no. Eaton. So it's Senator Eaton's in that. So in the House, I can speak that Representative Freiberg introduced it last year, and bills have a 2-year shelf life, so he's going to have to reintroduce it next year regardless. But I'm not even sure if it really got too much of more beyond an informational hearing, but I can try to check with Representative Freiberg and see where it's at, but I'm pretty sure he's going to reintroduce it next year, and we're going to start the conversation again.
Can I say something before we wrap up? Okay. So I just wanted to take a moment. I did give a retirement speech on the floor, but I want to make sure that I also said something to all of you while we are in this space together. This is my last town hall as a representative in District 46A, and I am honored and humbled to have been able to serve the community that raised me. It has been the honor and privilege of my life to be able to be entrusted with this seat when I have benefited so much from just the caring and incredible community that we have the great fortune to live in. So thank you for entrusting me with that. I may continue to represent you in some other capacity, but I am just honored and I'm honored and humbled to have been able to serve you. So thank you for the great honor of my life. So that's it. Miigwech. Thank you.
Representative Flanagan, I was not on the House floor, but you have served our community well, and thank you for that service.
And I don't want to cry here, so I'm not going to say anything.
All right, thank you all for coming out tonight.